Alright, so last night I didn't stream it, but I finished up the rest of this to-do list. We have to-do notes here, we have, uh, did I do that? Yeah, customizations for different types of the parenthesis matcher and the brace matcher, and the different, like, toggles for those different, settings. Pulling that stuff from the color palette, yeah, I did all that. So this is all done now. The things that are left are, um, oh, I guess I didn't save. I changed this because I fixed the performance problem, but there's like a texture binding changes too often problem. Um, Essentially with this one what's happening is I realized one of the problems I have with performance, I had basically two problems, and I tracked down one of them. The other one has to do with the fact that when you hit like a highlight or the cursor or something, you begin binding the font atlas, rendering it with it, and then binding to 0 and rendering a flat rectangle. And that's not strictly necessary. If we have an atlas, we could just have um, solid white somewhere in there, right? Like a solid full opacity block of like 3 by 3 or 2 by 2 or something, and just use that to sample from for these things. Then we don't have to bind textures anymore. So we might look at that, and that could help with performance. There's a couple of little commands people have requested that I might do, but today I'm going to say that new features are for now going to be pushed to the next build. Alright, so that's good. This I might do before we ship, I'm not sure. That's kind of a big change. I might put this off till next time. This will do, and now I want to find out documentation stuff. So, first problem is whenever I build the site these days, I don't actually get my errors like I'm supposed to. I get this. I don't know what I'm binding that isn't... Oh, I know what it is. Yeah, so I added a couple of these and I need to add them over here. Okay. Left release, right release, mouse wheel, mouse move, animate. One second, my computer sounds louder than it's supposed to be. Let me see something here. Okay, not sure what that is, but it's pretty high. I don't have my Discord chat up. Let me pull that before we continue. Uh-oh, let me check if my internet is being weird. No dropped frames. So what's going on over here? Why am I getting... Okay, there we go. Alright, so, There we go. So this is all the stuff that needs to get documented before we ship. It's a lot. So we're going to try to just churn through all of that today. Uh-oh. These aren't lined up. Okay, so now we just need to make our way through all of these things. Alright, buffer get manage scope. Doc param buffer ID. The ID of the buffer from which to query a managed scope. If the buffer ID specifies a valid buffer, the scope returned is the scope tied to the lifetime of the buffer. This is a basic scope and is not considered a user-managed scope. If the buffer ID does not specify a valid buffer, the returned scope is null. Okay. Doubter, hey there. So I have to, now that you're here, I was trying to talk to you yesterday and I asked if you were around but you weren't. But now that you're back, there's a lot for us to discuss, and since I'm having a down day, we can get all off topic while we're talking. So, let me pull up our conversation again, because I realized after we talked that there's a couple of things I should point out that I got wrong. So first of all, there's the fact that the idea of what I was doing for ranges when we were talking of doing the one-dimensional buffer, that doesn't really work in software rendering. I could have probably optimized it enough to make it somewhat viable, but it turned out that was just a very bad idea because of performance stuff. It is nowhere near fast enough to actually work, basically. Yeah, don't worry about answering fast. I'm just updating you on a couple of things I've thought about recently. So we were also talking about what is the exact nature of this problem, and I can't remember exactly what the confusion is, but I wanted to say something about it that I couldn't really, I didn't feel like it was worth trying to describe on Twitter. Yes, I feel like you might have also missed the solution I ended up using for ranges. So did you see the one that was like this? Did you see my final solution that was like the stack with endpoints? instead of the filling the one-dimensional buffer, the one-dimensional like texture buffer type thing. So that's the whole point as I was trying to describe yesterday. What I was doing was not GPU related at all. It was all CPU side. Um, so I could make it GPU side, but thank you, by the way, Slacky. But the way it was working was just I on the CPU allocated an array, rendered to it with CPU renderer, and then I'm issuing rectangles one at a time. And so I was just using that to query out of the array what's the color for this rectangle and sending it. It was just an easy way to get the mental model right for how to lay things out. Like, it was just an easy algorithm to get right, was the idea. And I thought I could make it fast, but I forgot that rendering is only fast on the GPU, unless you put a lot of work into it. So if I were going to do it, though, what I would do is each of these glyphs, when I submit them to the GPU, would get an index. It'd be like, this would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. And so each of them has an index that it can use to go into that array that I submit. And that array that I submit would probably be submitted as a texture, and so I would need some way to convert, like I would have to drop down to the low-level texel fetch type stuff, but point is, I'm thinking it would work something like, do I still have the picture on? No, I erased the picture on my whiteboard, but I'm thinking what I would end up doing in a like optimized engine is like this glyph here, I send it down with an XY rectangle, like the coordinates for an XY rectangle on screen, the UV rectangle from the texture, and an index that tells it like where to find all of its other information. And when it finds all that other information, what it's looking at is several textures that are one-dimensional, and so that like if this is index number 20, it goes to the 20th x, like the 20th thing in the one-dimensional texture for background color, the 20th position in the one-dimensional texture for foreground color, samples from both of those. So this would, the one problem with this is it's like highly multi-sampled. It's got the texture for the texture atlas for the glyph, and then it's got all these. In theory, I wouldn't actually need a bunch of more. I would need one more texture, which would be like an array of one-dimensional textures, right? It'd be a 1D texture array, and then like the first slice of that array is background colors, for instance. The second slice is foreground colors. And there might be more slices, like if I want to do the left, right, top, and bottom of each rectangle in 4 more slices. And so then I would render a color into each of those, and then these glyphs, as they're rendered, would know the rectangle and glyph and all that. And so in the shader, what they could do is pull the texel out of the texture atlas, pull these different colors from the index. So it's basically like if it's index 20, look at all of the different colors across all the slices at position 20, and they each go to a different thing. And so then it's like, okay, the background is a solid color like this, the foreground is a different solid color, do that blend in the shader and return solid colors. Or it could be, oh, the background is transparent, and so when we blend, we're blending to a 0 alpha thing, and then we emit that, and it gets blended to whatever's on the background. And it could also be like, oh, check if we're on the edge of the glyph rectangle, and then use the other four slices to do these rectangles. And then this whole render would basically become submitting one array, like one vertex array of all of the x, y, u, v coordinates and the IDs, and then submitting the texture atlas and submitting the like the 1D slices of all the colors, and that would be the whole render, right? A whole view in one go would be the plan then, with rectangles like cursors and highlight ranges. The only thing you couldn't do in that set would be the lines, because lines go past the end of where the glyphs are. So to get this stuff colored, you would do one pass that does back the line. You do like fill the background, do the line render, and then do the glyph renders. But the key is that each of these would have an index, and that index would be unique for everything on the screen, and then I would submit a single texture, a single 1D texture that has all the different things for background color, foreground color, and then other aspects of each glyph that need to be sampled out for the shader. That's the concept I was talking about before, in its like GPU version, which I'm not sure, but that is kind of like an extended version of the dynamic color palette that you were saying went pretty well, so it's something I might try when I'm doing engine stuff later. Alright, let me make sure I've eliminated all mentions of the word buffer here, and I have. Alright, then we have view start UI mode. Okay, view. The summary for the view to be altered, to be placed into the view which is to be placed into UI mode. This call returns non-zero on success. It can fail if view is invalid, or so you don't use it for only colors either. What else are you using it for? I'm curious. Like what besides colors, what else are you sampling? Scope color info. So I still do, because the way the API works still requires me to recreate the scope color each frame. The reason I have to do that each frame is that it's created, the API is set up in such a way that before render that data gets computed. If that was computed as an attachment that gets updated on modification of the text, I agree. I would be able to cache those things and only update the I would be able to only update the sort of 1D slices when any of the visual markers, visuals for the markers has changed. But I can't actually do that because the visuals for the markers will change for each render. So I would end up not getting anything out of the cache. It would never be different. I mean, I could like I see. Cool. Or if the view is already in UI mode. Before we go any further with this, I actually want to make sure well, let me finish this one first. So in UI mode, the view no longer renders its buffer. Instead, it renders UI elements attached to the view. The UI elements attached to a view can be modified by view set UI. Alright, before we go any further with that, I want to do the name cleanup first. Oh, and that reminds me, before we do anything else, before we ship, I also want to look at before dot name matches don't sort to the top like they're supposed to. Okay. Alright, so the thing I want to change is some of these names here. Visuals. I'm changing that to visual. Sorry. Buffer markers type. Marker visual type. Actually, visual type will be even better. Okay, I think those are all the changes I wanted to make. I'm saying I could cache things and only clean on dirty, but it's dirty every frame because the way the API works, the custom code resubmits those things and then clears them every time it renders. So there's no way for the API to determine that nothing has changed unless it did some kind of very complicated diffing process to see that the things that were just submitted match what was submitted last frame. But that diffing process would be more expensive than doing the render again, I suspect. So what's the point? If you have to do more work to determine if you're dirty than you would do if you just recomputed the thing you're caching, then you have not cached something that you needed that should have been cached. Now, what I could do is cache all the things except the stuff that changes scope, like cache all the things except the stuff that gets I could cache a render of all of the markers that exist before the render call, and then let the render caller modify just with a few more. Like it's like you know, if like these, for instance, these red lines and that gray line, well, not that gray, but these red lines here, those are all things that would be the same from frame to frame regardless of what happens. That I could cache. Well, the reason I don't want to make the custom layer give me info about whether it's dirty is that puts more work on the implementer to figure that out. Now they're responsible for figuring that out, and they can introduce bugs more easily by getting it wrong. I'm not really concerned about the performance of it because I've already got this part of the performance problem solved without going through the GPU. If I absolutely can't make it faster, we're talking about ways to make something faster that's already fairly fast. The reason I'm talking about it is because I want to maximize the amount of stuff you can push through, and you know, that's just to enable as many uses of the API as possible. But I'm not ready to make the trade-off of sacrificing the ease of the API for those trade-offs, because the API can already be implemented. Making the API harder to use for speed is a bad trade-off in this case, I think. Yeah, it's possible they could always just say I'm dirty if they don't want to get it wrong, and then for performance, if they need to get performance, then they can track it. That's possibly true. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll think about that someday, but right now I feel like that's the wrong move because it puts something new on the user that they didn't necessarily want to have to be thinking about. Now, it's possible that in the future something else will change, which is that the structure of event handling will be different, and that will might make it possible to think about the basically what the reason there's stuff that's dirty every time is the cursor can move around. So anything that's like I don't want to have to like read the entire buffer and add markup, and then every time there's an edit, reread the part that got edited and change the markup, because that's very hard to do. That's like really hard. Like if I have some markup here, and then I edit this portion and I delete it, and then put in some new stuff, and that all gets submitted as one replacement, because it could get submitted as one replacement, the process of figuring out what things to take off and what things to add would be very complicated, especially given that it has to be cooperative between separate modules. So I don't want to go down that road. So right now, the way the API is set up is to prefer solutions that are closer to immediate mode, in a sense that you're still making attachments and then clearing them, but you're doing it right when you're about to do the operation that's going to use them. So in a sense, you're declaring, here are the things I want attached for this render, and then they're gone afterwards. If they have to do an extra step in there, which is this the same thing I submitted to you last time? That would just be, I mean, that would just be for the sake of caching, which I'm not convinced is going to be too important. I mean, we're talking about a fairly small texture that we're rendering to. It would be no higher than like 6 or 8 or 10 pixels tall and a couple hundred pixels wide. Like, there's no reason that this render would be costly. So I'm just, yeah, I'm questioning why it would be, why this is, it doesn't feel to me like it's a place where the win is big enough to add caching, I guess. Because caching is just the source of bugs a lot of the time. Oops. And especially not things that change the API too, because leaking performance stuff out through an API is a great way to ruin, like, to make the API harder to use. Visual type. Yeah, I mean, I'm planning to take this kind of farther than people generally take a text engine, but I'm not building a game engine here that needs to like push the hardware to its limits. It's got to work on like a wide range of PCs, and so I don't want to be relying on too much fancy render stuff, and I don't want to rely on too much fancy like things in the API that mean you have to be an expert to get it right, because these things need to be very modular and pluggable to get, like, possible to plug together. And so like if we have 3 different modules all trying to report whether or not they've done anything different from last frame, that just starts to feel like, ooh, are we sure we've thought about all the cases here, or is there a way we can guarantee we get this right? And the way we guarantee we get this right is to eliminate caching and recompute everything that isn't too expensive to recompute. And as far as I can tell, the stuff that fits on the screen isn't too expensive. The only thing that ever might become a problem is the stuff that isn't on the screen could be a lot of stuff, and what happens with the stuff that isn't on the screen is I first have to find a way to look at only, like, I try to narrow down my search to only the set of things that are actually on screen, and right now that means literally a full iteration over everything and making records of all the stuff that was in the viewable range. That iteration across all the stuff is a good place where I feel like if there were performance problems, I would start there and look at, can I make a sort of something like a one-dimensional binary tree that is like a quad tree type solution that treats an object as a thing, like a range or a marker as a thing that gets placed in. Basically, it would be a thing that places markers in buckets based on where they are, and then when I'm rendering to a particular section of the buffer, I can say, here's where I'm rendering to, and it can go, here's the set of buckets that you need to query, and then iterate those, and I'm iterating, a fixed, like, I'm only iterating the stuff within a fixed range of where I'm at instead of iterating everything. That would be the kind of thing I would expect to actually become an issue. A lot of the assumptions that I work on are that, hey, we have a limited size screen and a limited number of characters that can show up on the screen. That number is not so big that it's ever going to be a huge problem as long as nothing's ever allowed to overlap and there's not tons and tons of stuff in the same location. Like, if there are 1,000 markers all right here rendering over each other, that would be a problem. But if we can find a way to take that down to one thing that gets rendered, which is usually possible, then there's not really a performance problem with getting stuff onto the screen. The performance problem with this tends to be more choosing, like zooming in on just the portion that we want to send to the screen so that we're not sending the whole buffer. If we sent the whole buffer, we'd have a problem. So the hard part isn't getting stuff to the screen, it's the more of the discovery of which things belong on the screen so that we can limit the things we send to the GPU to that set. That's kind of the approach I've been taking. Yeah, it's possible that if no one ever uses it, except for a few people who are doing really high performance stuff, and everyone else just ignores it and doesn't suffer from the fact that there's an option that they don't use that would make their life more complicated. It's true that that might be a win for the few things that need it. But, yeah, sort of priorities is, as you pointed out, the other factor here. How much am I gaining for that versus how much I'm losing by not working on other things, because that's going to be quite complicated. Plus, I don't know, I feel like you're still discounting the degree to which it would be complicated once we start doing multiple modules. If you author a module, and Jim authors a module, and Casey's written a module, and I want to use all of them because I think they're all awesome, how do I get them all to work if they're all trying to communicate with a caching system and doing different things that are like, oh, when the text gets edited, I need to see it so I can update my information and see if my cache has changed. And then two other people are also saying that. Does that mean every single text edit from now on is going to go through a chain of callbacks to find out all the modifications the different things want to make? That's the kind of thing that gets expensive, even though it's supposed to be an optimization. And I don't want to enable it. I wanted to ask a thing I asked on last stream and you said you had no times. Do you remember what I asked about commands opening menus next to buffers? Yeah, I remember that. By the way, since you weren't here, I remember what I wanted. Another thing I wanted from you is I lost the link, and I could go through the VOD and find it, but I haven't done that yet. So if you want to post the link to that thing you posted last time you were here, do that. Lex Martin, how do modules work in 4coder? First time I've heard of them. Modules don't really exist yet. I think they will exist in the beta, like in 4.10. Maybe they won't be there yet, but they'll be a lot closer to existing. But even without them formally existing, you could think of a module as just a library that you want to include into your code. So like if I have a folder that's like code from Casey, a folder that's like code from Doubter, and another folder that's like code from Jim, and I want all three of those to be included into my own customization, you could think of that as modules for what I'm talking about. And the reason that they're they're called separate modules is because they're written by people who didn't talk to each other, but who need to have lots of cooperative stuff. Like maybe two of these three modules do different things that create new buffers, and one of them does a thing that tracks stuff for every buffer that exists, like it tracks how long that buffer existed for. And so all of a sudden, without them ever having talked to each other as like implementers, the core API needed to facilitate a cooperation between them. So this is the concept of module I've been operating under. Is I have a little piece of code that needs to do a lot of cooperative stuff with other code near it without actually like knowing any of the names of things in that code, without knowing how many of those things that exist, without being tied down to a piece of that code, right? They want to be sort of easy to add and remove these things to the system. And to make that work, I need the core API to facilitate all that cooperation. Later, I plan to actually have a module thing. I think there might actually be a thing that's like, this command came from this module, and a module is a thing that has a name. It has its own variable IDs that are unique to it, and the other modules, that way, if as long as two modules don't have the same name, never have variables colliding. Variables as in the managed variable stuff. Stuff like that might be added someday, because there's a lot of benefit to being able to say, hey, here's a module that has a bunch of stuff, and within it there might still be things that don't want to be tied to each other directly in the sense that they both cooperate through the API. But it's a module because the person who wrote it wrote all of these things to work together, and so interconnections between them are possible, and they need to stay together as a module, and because it's got a name so that it can disambiguate itself from other modules, and you can like enable and disable them as sort of runtime elements. Like, hey, maybe on startup you have a bunch of module code and it says, hey, I've got all these DLLs that are different modules. I've loaded them all and asked them what their name is, but I haven't done anything else. And then you can say, okay, I want to enable all these modules, and the reason you don't, or like, I want to enable this set of them. And the reason you might want a feature like this is maybe you have certain modules that both do the same thing, and you installed one before and now you install a different one. So stuff like that might come in the future. It doesn't exist right now, but I'm building APIs with the thought in mind that someday this is going to be a thing. Nah, don't worry about it. I'll track it down somewhere else. I was just feeling bad because I said I was going to watch it, and then I closed the Twitch chat before I got a chance, and I haven't gone and dug it out of the VOD yet. But I have a bunch of ways I can look it up still, so I'll probably get around to that today, since I'm taking it more easy. Alright. Visuals into visual. Alright, let's see. Visual type. Visual type, visual type. Visual type. Visual type, visual type, visual. Visual. Do. Let me check it out real quick. I see you're still working on the same thing that that you were showing me when you were doing the dynamic color palette. This is pretty cool. Neat. Okay. Visual, 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 visual. Visual. Visual, 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 everything needs to say visual. Visuals with visual. Visuals with visual. Buffer markers type with visual type. Yeah, school always gets in the way of side projects. Although, I don't know, school never got so far in the way of side projects that I couldn't actually sacrifice schoolwork for it. It's just, you know that you probably shouldn't be sacrificing schoolwork for it, and that's a different thing. Like, if you're willing to ignore school a little bit more than you should, then school's actually kind of great for side projects, was my finding. You have to give up some perfectionism that I found hard to give up at times for school. Alright, so we've finished the rename. And now we can get back to this. Yeah, I can understand that. 11 hours is, wait, that's not, no, yeah, it's 11 hours is quite a lot on the brain. I'd be hard pressed to do real programming with that much work. on a daily basis. The summary, a summary for the view which is to be taken out of UI mode. Taking a view out of UI mode not only causes it to resume showing a buffer, but also sends a quit UI signal. When this signal is sent, when setting the UI widget data with view set UI, a quit function, the exit signal calls the quit function that is set by a view set UI call. Later, Doubter. Thanks for chatting. Alright. This is gonna get a little, it's gonna get a little bit long and slow here, so I'm gonna put on some music for myself. You'll probably want to do the same if you're hanging out. There we go. Alright. Okay, so a pointer to the baked UI widget data. To get a UI control data in the UI control format. See the helper called UI list to UI control. More information. About this, about setting up, specifying widget data can be found in a comment in 4coder UI helper.cpp. Alright, let's write that comment before we're done here. But first let me put in the rest of these parameters. Quit function, an optional, let's see, what happens if control is a null pointer? If this pointer is null, the view's widget data is cleared to 0. The core maintains its own copy of the widget data, so after this call, the memory used to specify widget data may be freed. An optional, a function pointer to be called when a quit UI signal is sent to the view. If this pointer is null, no, it is not called. This pointer may be null. Setting the UI widget data determines what the view will look like in UI mode. The UI widget data can be set no matter what the current mode is. The UI widget data can be replaced any number of times during UI mode, regardless of whether the view is in UI mode or not. see documentation on the UI widget data type, UI control, and the comment at the top of 4coder UI helper.cpp for more information about the types of widgets that can be used. All right. Alright, so that's set UI, now on to get UI. Man, this is a long list. This is probably going to be the whole thing we do today, is just churning through this whole list. Okay. Doc param view a summary for the view, blah 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 blah. A memory arena onto which the UI widget data will be allocated. Doc C view set UI. If the view is valid, then there is enough space in the part, then the UI control structure returned points to a copy of the widget data currently stored in the view, currently attached to the view. Alright, create user managed scope. Doc param. There are no doc params, doc return. Always returns the a newly created scope with a handle that is unique from all other scopes ever that have existed since 4coder was launched. That have been created either by the core or the custom code. The new scope is a basic scope and is a user managed scope. .param scope, the handle for the scope which is to be destroyed. .return, if the scope is a valid user managed scope, this function returns non-zero. Otherwise, it returns 0. This call can only operate on user-managed scopes. This means scopes gotten from views and buffers, views and buffers. This user managed scopes are those scopes created by create user managed scope. Scopes returned from scopes tied to views and buffers and the global scope are not user managed scopes. .c create destroy user managed scope. Create user managed scope. Always returns the handle to the global scope. The global scope is unique in that it is not dependent on any object with any object at all, and so has an infinite lifetime. No. The handle for the global scope never changes while 4coder in a 4coder session. And combine when used as a dependency in get managed scope with multiple dependencies, it has no effect. A pointer to an array of scopes, or a pointer to a block, to a contiguous block of scope handles, an array of scope handles which are to represent the various life dependencies that the returned scope will have. Doc param count the number of scopes in the scopes array. Doc return always returns the handle to a scope with the appropriate dependencies. Doc. Scopes with multiple dependencies are a subtle topic. For a full treatment, please read. I tracked down my blog post on this. There we go. a handle to the scope which is to be cleared. Returns if the scope handle refers to a valid scope, the return value returns non-zero on success and 0 on failure. This call can fail when the scope handle does not refer to a valid scope. Doc. Clearing clearing the contents of a scope removes all variable reset all variables to have their default values and frees all objects, all managed objects. The scope handle remains valid and new remains valid and refers to the same scope which still has the same dependencies. Wait, why do I have this thing twice with two different names? Okay, we gotta do a little bit of work renaming things now. The scope clears a scope and all the scopes which the parameter scope must be a basic scope, which means a scope with a single object dependency. Scopes tied to buffers and views, and scopes returned from create user managed and user managed scopes are all basic scopes, are the basic scopes. When this call treats, this call extracts, this call treats the scope as an identifier for the single object and clears all scope for the single object that the scope upon which the scope depends, and clears all scopes that depend on that object. This includes clearing scope itself. The only scope, the global scope, and scopes returned from get managed scope with multiple dependencies. The scopes returned from are the only other scopes that can be cleared by this call. That included scope via the union rule or for more on the union rule, read the full treatment of managed scopes here. Okay. The unique name for this variable default value. The default value that this variable will have when when in a scope that has not set this variable. Managed variable ID returns the newly created, returns a managed the new managed variable ID for the new variable on success or 0 on failure. This call can fails when a variable with the given name already exists. Creating a variable. Variables exist in scopes. But creating a variable does not mean that all scopes will allocate space for this variable. The space for variables is allocated on demand, sparsely on demand in each scope. So it is essentially free to create variables even if they once a variable exists, it will exist for the entire duration of the 4coder session, and will never have a different ID value. The ID will be used to set and get the value of the variable in managed scopes. .c managed variable get ID, create or get ID. For the variable on success, this call fails when no variable exists with the given name. Has the given name. This call first tries to get the variable ID in the same way that manage variable get ID would. If this fails, it creates the variable and returns the new ID in the way that managed variable create would. this parameter is ignored if the variable already exists. The advantage to using this call over manually using the other two is that it prevents doing the hash table lookup twice. That should be obvious, so I'm going to leave that out. Okay. Get, create, or get. Variable set. Doc param scope. A handle to the scope in which the variable, the new value, the value of the given variable will be set. Doc param location. The ID of the variable to set. The new value of the variable. Returns non-zero on success. This call fails if scope does not refer to a valid scope, or ID does not refer to an existing managed variable. From which the value will be queried. The destination and address where the value retrieved of the given variable in the given scope will be returned. Doc. If the scope and managed scope and managed variable both exist, then but the variable has never been set, then the default value for the variable that was determined when the variable was created is used in to fill value out, this is treated as a success and returns non-zero. Let's see, count the number of items allocated for this memory object. The total memory size is item size times count. Returns the handle to the new object on success, or 0 on failure. This call fails when if scope does not refer to a valid managed scope. Doc. Managed objects. Allocate memory that is tied to the scope when the scope is cleared or destroyed. All of the memory allocated in it is freed in bulk. And the handles to the objects never again become valid. Thus the handle returned by this call will only ever refer to the memory to this memory allocation. The ID for the buffer on which these markers will live. The markers are always placed into the scope of the buffer they are onto which these markers will be attached. The markers are always placed into the scope of the buffer to which they are attached. The markers will live in the scope of the buffer or in a scope another scope dependent on this buffer, thus guaranteeing that when the buffer is closed, all attached markers are freed in bulk with it. Doc param count the number of marker items allocated in this object. The memory size, the total memory size is size of marker times count. Doc param optional extra scope. If this pointer is non-null, then it is treated as a scope with additional dependencies for the allocated markers. This scope, in this case, the scope of the buffer and the extra scope are unioned via get managed scope with multiple dependencies, and the marker lives in the resulting scope. Doc return returns the handle to the new object on success or 0 on failure. This call fails if buffer ID does not refer to a valid buffer, or optional extra scope does not refer to a valid scope. Hey, Captain Craft and Fiery Drake, welcome! Let's see, what was I saying? The created managed object is similar to a memory object with an item size is essentially a memory object with item size equal to size of marker. The primary difference is that if the buffer referred to by buffer ID is edited, the position of all markers attached to that buffer can be changed by the core. Thus, this is not a memory storage, so much as position tracking in a buffer. I'm doing alright. I'm doing alright. We've got this really long list of docs to write today. I've been at it for, what, an hour and 40 minutes, and I haven't only done this, I also spent probably 30 minutes of that on renaming a bunch of stuff to finalize things, but yeah, this is probably at least an hour of work, which reminds me I actually have renamed something else that I haven't updated for yet, so let me rebuild and fix some more renaming problems before we continue. View begin UI mode. Manage scope, clear self and all dependencies. Thanks. That's very kind. Yeah, name stuff is like changing names costs a lot of time, and it's often frivolous because the new name is often not actually better, and you end up doing it several times. But I don't know how else you do it. Like, the only way to get a good name is to change it and then see, like, did I actually make it better by using it for a little while longer, reading it in a few locations where it was already there, and going, no, that doesn't clear it up in my mind either. And you're looking for all kinds of things. Like, you want it to be relative, you want its relative length to be proportional to the frequency of its use, such that you have shorter names for high frequency calls. You also want clarity, so that if you're reading code that you don't remember what this thing is called, and that also relates to that thing where if it's something you call every day, you don't need a lot of clarity because it's going to be in your active memory anyway. But really long names are nice for things that you don't use a lot, because that also helps you clarify what they do. But there's like a balance there that's just like really hard to find. Sometimes it's like I don't call this thing a lot, but I call it like 100 times in one spot. And for that one place, I don't want a really long name, but when I use any short names, it's too short to remember what it does or something. You know, it's like the quintessential design problem of like you just kind of trying things and kind of exploring a design space, but there's no method for finding the right name, I don't think. Alright. So, back to here. More. Uh-oh, we're crashing. I'm running an older version of 4coder where there was a crash bug that I have since fixed. Ha, that's nice. I feel like the real truth is I only sound articulate because I try to only talk about things that I've like sat and thought about for a long time. There are plenty of things, if you asked me to give my thoughts, I would ramble for a while before I found the right way to articulate it. Another part of that is to keep rambling until you find the right way to articulate it, and then make a big show of you saying, here's the thing, and clearing the slate so everyone forgets the rambling that came beforehand. I just did it right now if you weren't aware. Alright, yes. Alright. So, create marker visual object, right, okay. A handle to the marker object on which the new visual will be attached. Doc param. Wait, that's all the parameters. Doc return marker. Return is on success. Returns the handle to the newly created marker visual on success or 0 on failure. This call fails when object does not refer to a valid marker object. Doc. A marker visual adds graphical effects to the markers, such as cursors, highlight ranges, text colors, etc. The data for the visual is attached to the marker object and vice versa. Well, let me put it this way. A marker object can have any number of attached visuals. The memory in the core, the 4coder core for visuals, is stored in the same scope as the object. Doc.c destroy marker visuals. Order A, does 4coder have some kind of a function lookup? So the best thing 4coder has for that is this. So this gives you a list of all the functions in this file. It doesn't work across the whole project yet, and by whole project I mean all of the open buffers. I plan to make one that gives you just a list of all the functions in the entire, like in all open buffers. That shouldn't be too hard. It's a fairly easy parse problem. It's just my parser is too slow, or something along the way is too slow to handle lots of buffers right now. But it can do one big buffer, and then you can look at this and you can type stuff in like, I'm looking for my, what's the name of the thing that like gets the next, get next view, and then it'll jump you to it. K-Laryl, code completion is not yet on the horizon, but about your other requests, let me introduce marker visuals set look. Suppose that I think set look is a bad name for this, and it's more should be like set effect, which I actually believe is true. Then when I rebuild, give it a minute because my build process is a few seconds too slow. I can jump to it and it'll be marked like this. You see, so from here I can see that I have a couple of, here's a bunch of them that are all marked. Yeah, there's also stuff like you can find, if you know the name of the function, you can find all of its occurrences, which gives you where it's defined, declared, all of its called locations. Um, if you're trying to remember the name of a function, that doesn't help as much, but it can still help. Alright, so we need to document set effect. Let me check the time real quick. Alright, we got about 20 more minutes. I want to wrap this up before 6 here, so 20 minutes or so. We will not get much more of this done, probably to here, maybe? We'll see. Doc param visual a handle to the marker visual that will have the new effect. On which the new effect will be set. There we go, and that's nice and generic and can be copied to all of them. The type of effect this visual will create. Doc C, marker visual type. Refer to the enum docs for information. List of possible types and their properties. Doc param. Color. The color of the background of the highlight slash the color of the effect. The exact interpretation depends on the type of effect. The text color of the effect, the exact interpretation depends on the type of effect. Text style, not yet implemented, always set to 0. Doc return, returns non-zero on success or 0 on failure. This call fails when visual is not a valid, visual does not refer to a valid marker visual. Doc param visual again, it's this line. Doc param take rule. Describes the pattern for iterating over markers in the attached marker object when generating visual effects. Doc return. We also need a doc C on marker visual take rule. This is the same as this. And this time I want a doc here that says the not all markers in a marker object need to have the same visual effect applied by this marker visual. The take rule by default specifies, I should include that up here too, doc. The default effect is invisible. The default take rule takes all markers in the object. The take rule can be used for various types of swizzled patterns and can set different any start and end start index and total count for the visual. Yeah, so Calero asks, what about detecting compile errors before running the compilation? Yes, 4coder can't do that yet. The reason Visual Studio can do that, there's a few reasons. One, Visual Studio acts as your build system, so it doesn't just know what code it's going to compile, it also knows all the settings that will be applied to that code, what flags are going in, what macros are going to be defined, and it knows what compilation units exist. Like, does this file get compiled? Does this one include this one, or do they get compiled separately? They can even see like, oh, this file gets compiled and there are two different contexts, and do stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying they actually do all of that work. They just could. They actually tend to do more guesswork than that, which I find surprising because they do have a lot of that information. But C++ is actually just not a great language for that kind of thing because it's so contextual. Like, context stuff can change what is and isn't an error very easily. In fact, the only way to know whether a particular line has an error for sure is to compile all of the stuff up to it, and by compile I mean parse it and type check it all. That's extremely hard work. That is basically the entire front end up to that line has to be run to determine if that will compile. Sometimes even past that line. If you're in a class, things can be out of order. Members can come after they are, like, the declarations of members can come later. So you actually have to pretty much parse the entire compilation unit, do the whole front end, and then you can know where your compilation errors are in C++. And that can include things like going through headers, loading through other files, possibly even what happens if you include a standard library file. Do we also go and parse all of it and all of its dependencies? How do we know where all our include directories are? Again, we're not a build system. 4coder's not a build system. It doesn't know all the include directories that you're going to specify when you build your thing, so it has no way of finding all of the includes that it needs to do a proper parse. So it's just not really on the table for 4coder to do that kind of thing without completely taking over the build system the way Visual Studio does, and even then it's just a huge amount of work that is hard to get exactly right. Getting it approximately right like Visual Studio is more possible, but it's also just not worth it. I feel like the right thing to do is for 4coder to be a little bit more hands-off and say, look, if you really want that kind of feature, the custom layer is available. Go to town. Maybe switch to a language that can be parsed at a single file at a time, so that you can detect compilation errors without needing to find other files, without macros getting in the way. Then you can do a really good job at that. C++ is really poorly suited to being tooled, especially for editors. To a certain extent for compilers too, and so I'm just not even going to I'm just not willing to try to burn myself out on that kind of thing, you know? it's there's so many other places where we can get a win from good choices that it's not worth it. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Okay. Priority. Captain Craft asks, were any of these highlighting related changes fueled by the desire, I assume? Yeah, you said, yeah, you corrected it. To have debugging someday? Yeah, so there's a couple of main motivations. One is, it's just like a couple of basic things people have always wanted are line highlights, error highlights for compilation errors, um, um, a lot of people have wanted Notepad mode, so I can't demo it here because we're reusing 4coder, not running the most up-to-date version. But now there's a mode you can put 4coder in that isn't Emacs like with a mark and a cursor separately, but like it's got an I bar and you can highlight ranges by holding shift and arrows and stuff. So all of that now is possible because of all this stuff. So it's just actually a lot of features you can leverage once you have the ability to do more visual markup on the custom side. It also turned out this was a really easy way to get text coloring from the custom side, which we've never had before, and that gives us all kinds of new things we can do too. So it's really just like, this is all motivated by the fact that it happens to be a feature which serves a bunch of requests simultaneously, and yes, debugger support for breakpoints is one of them, but it's not actually the best thing. I think the UI stuff that I've done in this build will be bigger for you for debuggers, because now you can do better tables and UI like lists and things. Another thing I think is, even with the ability to highlight a line, that's not really what you want for a breakpoint, I don't think, because for a breakpoint you want a like widget thing that you can click on and interact with. With this, the best you could hope for is to have a command and like some kind of highlight that like marks this line, like a line highlight, so there's a breakpoint here, but there's nothing for you to click on to interact with it. And so I think like this Visual Studio style thing with line numbers and then breakpoints might still be what has to happen someday to fully get that part right. Okay. Priority. Alright, we're down to 10 minutes. The new priority for this marker for visual. Oops. Doxy marker visual priority level. Doc. The default priority level is C. View priority default. Higher priorities will, if two visuals both apply to the same character or range of characters, the higher priority visual is used. In case of priority ties, there is no rule to guarantee which visual effect is used. Clairol, so for C Sharp what we have so far, I can show you some of the C Sharp support. It's not great, but here's what we've got. If I go to tests, no, where's my it's data? Where is this? Code, build. Is it under 4ed now? Oh, it's under code, isn't it? No. Is it under non-source? Test data, there it is. Lots of files, sample files. So here's a C# file that I grabbed that's just a, some basic C# code, and you can see we have like basically the basic stuff you would want for C# handling. It doesn't do a lot of stuff, but like keywords that are not C++, like decimal, string, those are highlighted. They're understood as keywords. And that's basically the extent of it, is that it understands that this has a different keyword set than C++. Anything that's unique about C# in terms of special operators that aren't operators in C++, or things that are operators in C++ that aren't in C# will not be parsed correctly. But this is the level of the support, basically. And that's pretty much all that 4coder can do for C# right now. I mean, with this new build, it might be possible. Here's for each, by the way. So with this new build, it might be possible to take C# a little farther, because now you can do custom coloring on words and stuff, so you could get a little bit smarter with it. But it's not going to be much better than this anyway. Okay. Alright, let's get this view key in here, and then I think this will be the last one, and I'll sign off. So let's see. The ID for the view which this visual is to be keyed, to which this visual is to be keyed, or 0 to make the visual unkeyed. Doc. By default, visuals are unkeyed. A keyed visual will only be displayed in one a keyed visual will only be displayed in one view, in the view whose ID matches the key. An unkeyed visual is displayed in all views. Okay, yeah, so let me hit my to-do list here. So we're about almost halfway done with all the documentation work. I'll probably get the rest of this done over the week, and then next weekend we're going to hit these things, and I'm going to go through my final bug list and clear up as much of it, and by this time next week the new build will be out, so you can have that to look forward to. Thanks for hanging out, folks. I will see you all around later.